Hello class. These slides will highlight important concepts and theories related to rational choice theories of crime and biological and psychological theories of crime. So the major distinction between the rational choice theories of crime and the psychological and biological theories is that rational choice theories of crime assumes, as the name implies, that criminals are acting on rational incentives, that criminals are rational, and that they therefore can be deterred potentially by criminal justice. Whereas the psychological and biological theories state explicitly that there are problems with people's thinking, sometimes problems with their physical or biological constitution, that makes them more likely to be involved in crime. And so that, I think, is the major distinction between these two different schools of thought. The psychological is similar to the biological because psychology depends on the brain operating, and so those two are like one another in the sense that there's some abnormality that's assumed behind criminality, whereas the rational choice theories do not assume any psychological or biological abnormalities. They just assume that the environment creates incentives for people to want to act on their worst impulses. Okay, let's go ahead and get started.
Before talking about the details of rational choice or classical theory, I'd like to give you an overview of the development of criminological theory going back to the medieval era in Europe. Before we assumed that man was rational, in the pre-Enlightenment era, so we're talking before the 17th century, crime was pretty much synonymous with sin, and the broadly held notion that sinners are in league with the devil. So if someone did something that offended somebody's sensibility, like adultery or murder, that would be considered a sign that the person was a sinner and that they were perhaps in league with the devil. And the policy resolution for this problem of sin was, for one, for people to repent their sins and ask for forgiveness, and that's getting off very light, given the brutality of the period. More often, it would be resolved with a torture death, torture and public execution of the damned for their sinful behavior. As we move into the 17th and 18th centuries, the Enlightenment era is upon us, and a scientific understanding is applied not only to the physical world, but the social world as well. And this is where the classical perspective comes in. The classical perspective is synonymous with the rational choice theory because this is where we start to understand man, people, men, women, as rational actors pursuing their own self-interest. And crime is a result, this theory says, of rational choices. If the benefits of crime outweigh the costs, then people do the crime. So the policy resolution during this era, and this still carries through to our modern era, the entire criminal justice system, his system hinges on the assumption that people are rational. So the policy resolution then is that we need to make the costs of crime outweigh the benefits that crime doesn't pay. An old adage that I'm sure that you've heard before. Well, the classical period, or the classical perspective, I should say, has been challenged in the 20th and 21st century by what is known as the positivist perspective. And for most of your book, the focus is on the positive perspective. So rather than seeing crime as a result of rational choices, people pursuing their own self-interests, crime, from this perspective, is thought to be caused by biological, psychological, and sociological factors. And that free will is an illusion. Like any other molecule in the universe, it's not assumed to have free will. So why would we assume humans, us, a collection of molecules, to have free will? So this is just what we understand as traditional science being applied to the study of criminal behavior. And the policy resolution with this assumption is that we need to identify the causes of crime and treat them like we would any other problem that's not directly related to human behavior. The classical perspective or rational choice theory has some influential people and ideas that I'd like to highlight in this slide. One person of major importance is Cesare Beccaria on crimes and punishments, which he wrote in 1764. And he had the revolutionary idea that punishments should be commensurate with the offense, that the punishment should fit the crime. That is where that saying comes from Beccaria. And that he was also big into what we understand now as deterrence, and that he described deterrence containing three components. One, severity. Punishment needs to be severe enough to outweigh the benefits of committing the crime. Two, celerity. Punishment needs to be swift and have any sort of deterrent effect. Like it can't be delayed by years to be effective deterrent for a rational actor. And most importantly, though, is the certainty of being punished, or the likelihood of getting caught and punished must be high. So again, we're assuming here that people are rational and that these three components, especially the third one, certainty, is going to appeal to any rational actor, no matter how extreme their behavior, whatever devilish things they're planning, that if you have a punishment that is severe enough, it's going to be delivered swiftly and with a high degree of certainty. This should deter people from their planned deviant actions and may even curb some people's impulses to something more civil. Further, there are three different kinds of deterrence. There is general deterrence, so this is laws that are out there to deter crime in society. There is specific deterrence, and this is punishment to deter specific individuals from committing crime again, hence the man sitting in the jail cell being forced to think about his wrongdoing, and hopefully that punishment will convince him it's not a good idea to break the law, do not do it again. And third, this is the more modern idea of focused deterrence, that really you need to put high pressure, or a lot of pressure, to deter high-risk individuals, people that have a record, they have a long rap sheet, police, probation, they know who they are, and they need to come down on them first with a stern warning that we're watching you, we're going to make a special project out of you, so do not break the law again, or we will come down on you hard. And if you want to click on the link, there are people talking about the application of focused deterrence. So rather than having a zero tolerance policy and just arresting anybody for the smallest crime, what you want to do is use your criminal justice resources more wisely and focus on the profligate sinners, people that are in and out of jail on such a regular basis. I know who they are, and you need to focus on them because we know from prior research that a shockingly small percentage of offenders are responsible for the majority of crimes in any major city. It's like 5 or 6% of offenders in a given year are responsible for over 50% of the crimes. And so the focused deterrence idea is a popular one, and one in which we would hope more criminal justice agencies adopt that instead of zero tolerance, which zero tolerance can be effective, but it's also expensive and politically controversial. Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832, is another very important person, had some influential ideas in the classical/rational choice perspective. That he saw crime as rational, as a type of hedonic calculus worked out in the mind, that everybody, including you, dear listener, are always trying to maximize their pleasure while minimizing pain, and that the aim of punishment is to prevent crime, not to exact revenge or to restore some sort of cosmic justice, setting the scales of justice back into place, so to speak. And Bentham, along with his colleagues, were a major influence on the framers of the U.S. Constitution, most specifically the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which forbids cruel and unusual punishment. That, according to Bentham and colleagues, that this is counterproductive if you use torture deaths to punish adulterers and murderers. That just makes no sense, and that the aim of punishment is to prevent crime, not to see how much gore you can produce in a public torture death. And there's a picture of Bentham. Bentham and his ideas are part of a larger philosophical idea called utilitarianism. And utilitarianism, there's a lot to it, and you can follow the link. And you do want to follow the links in these slideshows. It'll help you to fill in the gaps where I'm just not smart enough to explain this stuff, but there are people far smarter than me can do a better job. The idea underlying utilitarianism, that you want to do the act that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And that is also been worked into our criminal justice system, that we don't go overboard in our punishments using things like torture deaths to beat the devil out of people, that we do that act that minimizes the amount of force governments need to produce the best results. It's another way you can think of it. More recent iterations of rational choice theory falls under the broader rubric of neoclassical theories. A few examples include the rational choice theory by Clark and Cornish. This theory highlights the concept of bounded rationality, that yes, while all human beings have the potential for rational choices, these choices are made with limited information. And this helps to explain why people with the potential for rational thought sometimes behave in ways that seem like they're not rational. They are rational, it's just that they're not geniuses. In this theory, it's also important that we look at criminal situations or events rather than the criminal him or herself as the focus of criminological inquiry. And there are several examples below that highlight the importance of looking at the situation in addition to the individual. One is the classic prisoner's dilemma, and this is where you want to follow this link. It explains what happens when two rational actors are pitted against one another and they have to make decisions that maximize their own self-interest. What they end up doing is, well, screwing each other over or ratting on one another, even though if they would have cooperated, they both would have been better off. Another one is the Hobbesian trap, where two people do not have any violent designs on one another, but they are pitted against one another in a situation where one person is afraid that the other person is going to do something violent, and the other person thinks the same thing of the other person until they both find themselves attacking one another for fear the other will attack first. The classic example is a burglar breaks into your house. Now, the burglar doesn't want to kill you, and you don't really want to murder someone either. However, you find one another in close combat. If you have guns, well, you finish the story. That's a Hobbesian trap. It applies also to international relations. The whole world, according to some political scientists, is in a constant Hobbesian trap. It's only through diplomacy we find our way out of this. There is a famous scene from the movie Reservoir Dogs, where in this movie, all the criminals are depicted as rational actors, yet they find themselves in a so-called Mexican standoff or Hobbesian trap in the final scene of the movie, where none of them really wants to murder one another, but they all kill each other anyway. Classic scene, click on that, and you'll get a good bloody Quentin Tarantino version of the Hobbesian trap in action. Another really popular neoclassical theory or rational choice based theory is the routine activity theory by Felsen and Cohen. Routine activities theory builds on empirical data looking at crime rates between the 1960s and 1970s, 1960 and 1975. During this period, crime in all categories increased dramatically in the United States. Yet during the same period, you had unemployment rates declining and high school completion rates for minority youth increasing. So from a naive sociological perspective, one might say you would expect crime to go down, not go up. But what Felsen and Cohen are pointing out is that during this period, when more kids are completing high school and employment rates are on the decline, you had an increase in suitable targets, empty homes, for example, as well as an increase in portable goods, things that are just easy to steal. Also, you had a change in the number of capable guardians around these suitable targets. And this is because this is the time in which more women were out of the home, working, earning their own paycheck, and more people were just traveling because of the ability to do so with the economy and the changing ability of transportation, leaving a lot of homes open to victimization. And so the routine activities theory assumes that motivated offenders are rational, but says that other two elements have to be involved. A suitable target has to be present, and also a lack of capable guardians.
We'll begin with biological theories of crime and a little history on that. Cesare Lombroso, 1835 to 1909, was an Italian physician and considered one of the founding fathers of modern criminology, pictured here on the right. He led the movement from classical school to scientific positivism. So the notion that criminal behavior, while on the surface seems like it may be rational, also has to it some biological substrates that differentiate people that are criminal from people who are not criminal. In his book, The Criminal Man, he highlights various traits that he thought indicated that some individuals were more criminal than others. One interesting tidbit in this book is the significance he attributes to tattoos. Now, during Lombroso's time, not many people had tattoos. Sailors, men in the military, and criminals. Now, it's not that Lombroso thought that tattoos caused crime, of course. He did think, however, the tendency to want to get a tattoo indicated something deviant about one's nature. And while it may be small, if you blow up the drawing of the tattoo, you'll be able to read the passages below it, and some of them you might find disturbing, if not humorous. So check that out. But tattooing, he thought, was an indicator of innate criminal tendencies. He also thought there were physical traits that one could see by just looking at bodies that would indicate what he called atavism, or evolutionary throwbacks, that serious criminal offenders were just not as evolved as the average civil person. So such as low sloping foreheads, indicated in the man up in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, broad noses, and small cranial capacity, so relatively small heads. Later, he wrote a book called The Criminal Woman, that he did not leave women out of his theory. And again, he thought that women's bodies, the ones that were more antisocial than the average woman, there would be indicators on their body. And he found that, and he was not hallucinating, he really was documenting this, that on women that were arrested, for example, for prostitution, they had more of a prehensile foot, that the big toe was more separated from the smaller toes, which would suggest a more primitive or ape-like foot, which would explain their criminality as well as their lasciviousness, their tendency to be hypersexual. So Lombroso, while his theories today are not taken to be the most progressive ideas about why people offend, we can't completely dismiss him,
Because again, it's not as if he was hallucinating or fudging the data or making this stuff up. There are observations he was making about physical differences between especially serious criminal offenders and people in the civilian population. Starting in the 1880s, the theory known as phrenology became popular among experts. And this theory said that the exterior of the skull reflected something about the shape of the brain and the functioning of the mind. The idea was that there are bumps and grooves on one's head that may say something about their personality, as well as whether or not they have any ingrained criminal tendencies. If you click on the link, it goes into some more detail about phrenology. And then you definitely want to click on the link to the movie scene from Django Unchained, another Quentin Tarantino movie. You can't tell I like Quentin Tarantino's movies. And in it, there is a scene where Leonardo DiCaprio's character, who plays an awful, sadistic plantation owner and slave keeper, wants to demonstrate that his black slaves truly are subservient to him by cracking open the skull of a slave girl that's attempting to be rescued, by showing that on the inside of her skull there are going to be these little bumps that would indicate her subservience. And so while today phrenology is seen as just bunk pseudoscience, during its heyday it was thought of as a serious form of scientific inquiry by people going to the most prestigious universities such as Harvard and Yale. Later in the mid-20th century, we have the popularity of somatotyping theory, championed by Sheldon, W.H. Sheldon. And while it is true that the human body varies, that there are, according to Sheldon and others, essentially three different body types. There is the endomorph, the ectomorph, and the mesomorph. Most of us fall somewhere in between these ideal or stereotypic types. What is more controversial or perhaps interesting about Sheldon's theory is that in addition to the human body varying in these reliable ways, that he also believed that certain personality traits are linked with these different body types. So endomorphs, the people who are more soft and round-bodied, were thought to be more extroverted, more jovial. The ectomorphs, the tall, lanky people, are lean and fragile, but also thought to be introverted. And then we have the mesomorphs, the more athletic type body. And that perhaps to no surprise, these are the individuals that were thought to have a more aggressive temperament, and a temperament also better suited to criminal behavior. And like Lombroso, Sheldon was not hallucinating. It is the case that more violent criminals happen to fall in somewhere in the range of mesomorph type bodies. So we cannot completely dismiss Sheldon as being a quack, that he was not making this up, at least not fudging his data. A little later in the 20th century, you had the popularity of the so-called super male. There is a rare genetic or chromosomal abnormality, XYY, where Y is the male chromosome. And if you have an extra Y chromosome, then you're thought to be more male and therefore more likely to be involved in violent criminal offending, as men are more likely to be violent than women. If you're more male, then naturally you should be more involved in violent crime. Well, it turns out that while there is more criminal offending among this relatively small population, less than 1/10% of 1% of the male population has this chromosomal disorder, it's not that they're more involved in violent criminal behavior. It's other types of criminal behavior, nonviolent, property offending, for example. There was a mass murder in the 1960s by Richard Speck, shown on the bottom right. And at the time, the media and other scientists jumped to the conclusion without evidence that, well, he must be an XYY male because he had other characteristics thought to be associated with it. Well, it turns out that that's not the case. He is not a super male. He was just a regular XY male. So again, while this super male theory does not pan out as what was originally thought, there is something to chromosomal disorders being linked with some criminal tendency, just not violent crime. Starting in the 19th and early 20th centuries, you have the social policy known as eugenics. And eugenics comes in two forms. First, we had positive eugenics, championed by the likes of Sir Francis Galton, who happened to be Charles Darwin's nephew, as well as a major influence on the development of statistical analysis. Galton was a proponent of positive eugenics, that this is the promotion of good genetic stock by encouraging the wealthy to breed. Galton was afraid that the wealthy were being overrun by the poor, who had higher rates of fertility. It's still true today that in the 21st century, the poor tend to have more children than the wealthy. Well, if that sounds strange to you as a social policy, it took an absolutely ghoulish turn when it migrated across the pond over to the United States in the 20th century with negative eugenics. And that is what it sounds like. It is the reduction of bad genetic stock through forced sterilization, championed by the likes of Charles Davenport and many others in the United States, many others in the intellectual class who actually considered themselves on the liberal side of the political spectrum, who thought that positive eugenics will just never work because you can't really encourage the wealthy to have more children. They will see it against their own, being against their own best interest. But you could keep the poorest of the poor from breeding too often, and that the targets for negative eugenics included the mentally ill, the feeble-minded, many of whom came to the attention of the authorities because of their criminal convictions. And there are photographs of Galton and Davenport on the right, as well as below it is a placard talking about the eugenics laws in the state of Indiana. And then there are scenes from the great movie Sling Blade. If you guys have not seen Sling Blade, you have to see this movie. It has Billy Bob Thornton playing someone who has severe cognitive deficits, who's being released from a mental institution. He was held there for most of his adult life for a violent crime he committed when he was a child. And it raises a lot of moral questions about whether someone who has severe cognitive deficits, if they commit a violent crime, should they ever be released? Can they ever be trusted again? And it's the scenes in it show some of this, and it is worth checking out. If you have not seen this movie, you need to see it, because the character that Billy Bob Thornton is playing, if this character would have been born 100 years prior, he's exactly the type of person that the government would have targeted for eugenics policies, because he would be considered feeble-minded. Now, we don't use the term feeble-minded anymore to describe somebody who has severe cognitive deficits, just like we don't use the terms idiot, moron, or imbecile as clinical diagnoses. They used to be, though. We just don't use them anymore as that, for those purposes, I should say. Behavioral genetics is still a rapidly growing field, more rapidly growing than ever before because of technologies like CRISPR-Cas9. But it started much earlier with family studies showing that crime seems to run in families, with studies of the Jukes and the Kallikaks in 1912. And what they found, the researchers that worked on this, found that in addition to crime running in families, there are the traits of low IQ or feeble-mindedness. More recently, though, are twin and adoption studies that again tend to indicate there are some biological underpinnings to criminal behavior. So in the twin studies, what they do is they compare monozygotic or identical twins to dizygotic twins or fraternal twins. And monozygotic twins have the same DNA, whereas dizygotic twins have very similar DNA, but no more similar than a regular full brother and sister, or full-blooded brothers or full-blooded sisters. Well, it turns out that monozygotic twins have higher concordance rates than dizygotic twins, meaning that their behaviors, their criminal tendencies are more similar to one another than dizygotic twins are similar to one another, suggesting that your biology plays a role in your criminal tendencies. There's also the adoption studies that compares adopted and biological parents to child behavior, and this finds that biological parent crime records are a better indicator than adopted parent records. So a child that is adopted may be reared into a family that is highly conventional, yet if their father was a serious criminal offender, that adopted child will have criminal tendencies that are more like the biological father than the adopted parents, even though all of his socialization was done by the adopted family, that biology has a hand in his tendency to act out in a criminal way. So again, suggesting that biology does play a role. More recently than that are studies of neurology of the brain, finding that there are differences in parts of the brain of individuals who are involved in serious criminal offending compared to those individuals who are of civil behavior or no more criminal than the average population. So specifically, there are differences in the orbital frontal cortex and the amygdala. So the orbital frontal cortex is part of the brain that's responsible for what we know as moral reasoning and self-control, whereas the amygdala is responsible for impulses, and that there are documented differences between the brains of non-criminals and criminals. And if you click on the link by where it says neurobiology of evil, there is a scientist there that is talking about this issue in greater detail. Discussions on the biology of crime tend to shade into discussions on the psychology of crime. The two are closely linked, especially in more modern research. And so we'll begin, though, with classic example, starting with Freud's psychoanalytic theory and his structure of the psyche, which has three parts. The first is the id, and these are basic biological instincts. And civilization, our social norms and our culture, contain the id. They control our worst impulses. And there also is the superego, and this develops from experience, and this is the internalization of social norms, the rules of society as we learn, as we develop. And then there is the middle part, so to speak, the ego, and this helps to negotiate the demands for instant gratification of the id with the rules of the superego. This is the you that tries to cope with what you want and what society says is right or wrong. And according to Freud, criminals, the common criminal, suffers from a weak ego, the inability to negotiate the impulses of the id with the demands of the superego. So you can think of the average criminal as having a weak ego, or more commonly described as just having poor self-control or poor impulse control. And the cartoon over on the right has an example of this, this being food, somebody being really hungry, that's your id, and then superego saying that no, you can't eat right now, you have other obligations, and then your ego there in the middle saying, okay, this is what I have to do to contain my id by satisfying the demands of the superego, the rules of the culture of the society. Criminals have a hard time doing this, according to Freud. Well, intelligence, as we have hinted at before, has been linked to criminal offending. Charles Goring, researching English convicts in 1913, found that prison inmates tend to score lower on intelligence tests than the average population. Further IQ testing within U.S. prison populations reveals similar results, with about 8 to 10 points in IQ below the average population of 100. where 100 is the average IQ score in the population. Now, other researchers have had a slightly different take on this finding. It's not that IQ has a direct effect on crime, according to Hershey and Hendelang. It's that individuals with low IQ tend to not form bonds with people in school and their school teachers. And it's because of the lack of bonds, of social bonds to people in school, and particularly to the teachers in school and the institution itself. It's why you see a connection between IQ and criminal behavior. So it's the social control theorists' assertion that it's not really intelligence, it's the social bond to social institutions such as school and the teachers in the school and the authorities in the school that is what really matters. But if you have substantially low IQ, then you're going to find school very frustrating, and you're just not going to be able to form those bonds that keep you from acting on your worst impulses. Different from intelligence as a potential correlate of crime, or I should say low intelligence as a correlate of crime, is the so-called psychopath or sociopath. Now, people debate whether there is a real difference between a psychopath and a sociopath, and whether or not these are real abnormalities that can be identified in the population, or they're sort of figments of psychologists' imaginations. But there are certain characteristics identified by Robert Hare and others that tend to crop up when we're looking at individuals who are involved in crime of a particularly violent or disturbing nature. That these tend to be individuals who are glib and have some superficial charm. They tend to have a real lack of empathy for others. They tend to have very short-term relationships, especially short-term romantic relationships, can't form that kind of romantic or loving bond with another human being for a very long period of time, too selfish. They also tend to be impulsive, and they're criminally versatile, that they cannot keep their hands out of the cookie jar, so to speak, that they're involved in all kinds of dirty deeds. The journalist Ron Johnson has a clip here giving a talk about strange answers to the psychopath test. And his point here is that everybody is a little bit psychopathic, that there are characteristics about you and about other people you might know that you could check off on Robert Hare's psychopath checklist. And so we should always keep that in mind when we are thinking about the extremes of human behavior, that we all fall in some continuum of psychopath or sociopath. Thankfully, most of us are not characterized by all of these traits. We just have some of these traits some of the time. Well, a movie that I think does a really good job in highlighting some of these psychopath or sociopathic traits is the movie American Psycho. This is another movie. If you guys have not seen this, you have to watch this movie. The scenes that are shown here do a good job of showing not so much violence, which there's plenty of violence in this movie, violence and gore, but just the psychology, the thinking of someone who is a psychopath, how they are so self-absorbed and so concerned about these things that most people would find, well, unimportant or superficial, but they are absolutely all-consuming for someone who is psychopathic and just so self-absorbed that they cannot see beyond them. And so check these scenes out. It depicts the character Patrick Bateman, who is a high-status individual involved in some sort of financial institution, and it just shows how shallow he is, and that is something that tends to characterize psychopaths and sociopaths. Related to this is the dark side of high self-esteem, that contrary to the popular notion that some individuals commit crime because of low self-esteem, and that may be true. People who are particularly dangerous actually do not suffer from low self-esteem. They suffer from too much self-esteem, too much confidence, hubris, arrogance, all of that. And that there is a paper posted on Moodle, which I'd like you to check out, called The Dark Side of High Self-Esteem. And it is true that violent and or aggressive individuals tend to score higher than average on self-esteem assessments. They tend to be highly sensitive to challenges too, that they have a high self-esteem that's rather fragile and very sensitive to insults, that they will sort of lose it if someone challenges their status or thinks less of them and does not think that they're the best thing since sliced bread. And they may not be receptive to treatment or rehabilitation. It's one of these things where you can try as you will in correctional programs to get people to feel more for the victims, where some criminals will feel guilt and feel remorse, but the psychopath, the sociopath is just incapable of doing this, not interested. It also tends to characterize not only criminals, but also some politicians, according to Robert Hare and others, as well as many of the rulers of yesteryear, that in order to rise to the top in a brutal era, you had to be a little psychopathic, just to sort of to resist the more forgiving parts of human nature and to waste your enemies and not really care so much about the sort of awfulness you've wrought.